Well, we have a packed schedule today, so I see people are still coming in. I'm just going to go ahead and get us rolling on some housekeeping stuff before we get started with the real presentation. So just really briefly, my name is Jess Bunting. I'm the CPWR Research to Practice Director. I'm also the host and tech support for these events, so you may recognize me if you've attended previous webinars. Like all of our webinars, today's webinar is currently being recorded. It will automatically be shared via follow-up email. So with everyone who registered for the event, you don't have to reach out, you will automatically get that follow-up email. But in addition to that, we will also be posting the recording and slides on cpwr.com and also on stopconstructionfalls.com. With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panel for today. You will probably recognize these names if you've attended a safety stand down event with us in past years. We are going to be hearing first from Dr. Scott Ernest, who is the Associate Director for Construction in the Office of Construction Safety and Health at NIOSH. Then we'll be hearing from Timothy Irving, who's currently the Acting Director in the Directorate of Construction at OSHA with the DOL. We're gonna hear some training from Rich Truen, who is the chair of the NORA Construction Sector Council Falls Work Group that supports the safety stand down every year. And then finally, we're going to hear from CPWR's Executive Director, Chris Trahan-Kane, about some actionable resources that you will walk away with today. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you, Scott.
Great. Thanks, Jess. And good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you today. Thanks for joining. And thanks for taking time out of your day to focus on construction safety and fall prevention. Falls continue to be the leading cause of construction worker deaths. Next slide. The Falls campaign began in 2012 with NORA, NIOSH, OSHA, and CPWR raising awareness that falls are the leading cause of construction fatalities, accounting for 1/3 of construction deaths, with a disproportionate number occurring in residential construction. The annual stand down is part of the national campaign to prevent falls in construction, a nationwide event to raise awareness of slips, trips, and fall hazards and prevent injuries and fatalities. Safety stand downs are voluntary events for employers to talk directly to employees about safety. The Falls stand down is an opportunity to distribute educational materials, train workers, and discuss safety policies and goals. Material focused on small contractors is available on our websites. This year, we're bringing our most committed partners into the fold more formally, and we're also focusing on the often overlooked issue of fall rescue planning. Next slide. So why is this event still important? Quite frankly, it goes back to the significant number of injuries and fatalities that occur every year. Much of the BLS data in these slides are from CPWR reports. In 2021, nearly half of all fatal slips, trips, and falls occurred to construction workers. Since 2013, there have been approximately 300 fatalities and 20,000 injuries each year from falls in construction. And lastly, falls from elevation accounted for 95% of all slips, trips, and falls, and 50% of all non-fatal slips, trips, and falls. Next slide. Next slide. This slide shows data from 2011 to 2022 with slips, trips, and falls on the top and falls to a lower level on the bottom. In 2022, there were 412 fatal slips, trips, and falls in construction. 96% of those resulted from falls to a lower level. From 2011 to 2022, the numbers of these types of fatal falls increased 53%, corresponding to more workers, but rates increased 13%. From 2011 to 2022, the number of fatal slips, trips, and falls increased about 5%, while fatal falls to a lower level increased about 4.7%. The rates for both categories decreased slightly from 2011 to 2022. Next slide. For this slide, the blue bar chart on the left shows the number of fatal slips, trips, and falls by subsector for 2022. The pie chart on the right shows the fatal falls by firm size from 2011 to 2022. Again, on the left, roofing contractors had the highest number of fatal slips, trips, and falls of 100. Numbers were also high among residential construction at 63 and commercial and institutional building construction at 31. Looking at fatal falls by firm size from 2011 to 2022 on the right, approximately 70% of fatal falls occurred in small firms with 1 to 10 employees, while about 7% occurred in large firms with 100 or more employees. So to summarize, small firms accounted for 57% of all fatal injuries, and large firms accounted for 13%. Small firms make up about 81% of all construction firms, but only 22% of the workers. Next slide. This slide shows the source of common fatal slips, trips, and falls in 2021 and 2022. As you can see, the largest number of falls occurred from roofs, ladders, and scaffolds in that order. There were approximately 150 fatal falls from roofs, approximately 100 falls from ladders, and approximately 50 from scaffolds. Falls from roofs increased from 2021 to 2022, and falls from ladders decreased during that same time period. Next slide. Looking at non-fatal falls from 2011 to 2022, the number of slips, trips, and falls increased 13%, while the rate decreased about 18%. The number of falls to a lower level from 2011 to 2022 increased 2%, while the rate decreased 25%. In the two most recent periods, the number of non-fatal slips, trips, and falls decreased about 6%, while the rate per 10,000 FTEs decreased about 10%. Seeing the non-fatal fall numbers decrease from 2021 to 2022 is a step in the right direction, but rates of falls, and especially fatal falls, haven't improved. However, all falls are preventable. Next slide. CPWR conducted a fall experience survey among construction safety experts with direct knowledge of construction falls. There were 671 survey respondents, and the next few slides present some of the results of that survey. In a series of questions about the use of fall protection, nearly half of the respondents indicated that the individual who fell was not using any fall protection. When fall protection was used, personal fall rest systems were the top choice. Looking at fatal versus non-fatal falls, for fatal falls, 62% were using some form of fall protection, but the remaining 38% were not. In non-fatal falls, 53% were not using fall protection. There was a correlation between the height and use of fall protection, as falls from greater heights were more likely to be fatal. Next slide. When asked whether the worker who fell believed fall protection was required by the employer, only 45% said yes. Looking into whether requiring protection led to the use of fall protection, CPWR found that when fall protection was thought to be required, it was used close to 80% of the time. And when workers did not think that it was required, it was used only 22% of the time. Next slide. The survey investigated underlying causes and contributing factors to falls. This slide shows the top 10 underlying causes. When asked directly about the primary causes of the fall, based on opinion or investigation results, the number one response selected was insufficient or ineffective planning. That was followed by fall protection being provided but not used, and improper use of fall protection. Lack of relevant training was also a major cause of the fall. Next slide. Thinking about other factors that may have contributed to the fall, respondents were asked if the worker who fell was new to the workforce. From this data, that did not seem to be a significant factor. When asked about whether the individual was working for a general or a subcontractor at the time of the fall, the results suggested that those working for a subcontractor were at a greater risk, particularly for fatal falls. While 44% of those who experienced a non-fatal fall were working for a subcontractor, 64% of those who died were employed by a subcontractor at the time. Workers employed by subcontractors face an elevated risk of dying in falls. Individuals who work for a subcontractor at the time of the fall were 2.7 times more likely to die from the fall compared to those who were employed by a general contractor. Next slide. This survey also asked about how often they witnessed various job site safety actions, and this slide shows the results. Pre-planning, prevention through design, fall rescue, equipment inspection, and proper setup and maintenance. Those were all in this slide, with various levels of frequency from always to never. I just wanted to note that the positive responses for fall rescue planning and prevention through design were lower than responses for the other questions. With that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Tim Irving, Acting Director of the OSHA Directorate of Construction. Tim?
Very much, Scott. I appreciate that. I'd like to just talk about three things during this presentation and highlight the three things related to the National Emphasis Program on falls. The stand down itself, Scott covered a lot of that, but I just want to talk about some new things that we have going. And leading into Rich's presentation on the importance of the competent person. And as Scott mentioned, this is our 11th National Safety Stand Down, and it is part of the much larger fall prevention campaign that goes on all year. And since the beginning, our goal has remained the same: raising safety awareness to prevent fall-related fatalities and injuries. And despite our collective efforts, falls remain the leading cause of death in construction. For us at OSHA, it's particularly tough knowing that these incidents could be prevented. I'd also like to connect this presentation to one of the Assistant Secretary's priorities, specifically safety is a core value, and how safety should be at every level, at every organization. So if you remember last year at the fall stand down, Assistant Secretary Doug Parker signed the Fall National Emphasis Program, and it became effective May 1st of last year. And this emphasis program focuses on reducing fall-related injuries and fatalities for people working at heights. The National Emphasis Program aligns all of OSHA's fall protection resources to combat one of the most preventable and significant causes of workplace fatalities. We jumped ahead 2 slides. I'm actually going to be on the purpose slide, Rosa. You're ahead 2 slides. Yep, right there. Thank you very much. So why does the National Emphasis Program on Falls matter to you? The Fall NEP is intended to serve as a guide on how OSHA conducts enforcement and compliance assistance activities. It can be used to mitigate or remove workplace dangers linked to working at heights. The NEP outlines strategies and processes to identify and reduce fall hazards. And this NEP oversees all inspections in construction and non-construction activities. Next slide, please. Now, Scott presented a lot of fall data with fatalities and injuries. What I'm showing on the screen now is Bureau of Labor and Statistics data from 2020. And of the 5,486 workers that lost their lives, 16% of those fatalities in all industries were related to falls. So 865 fatalities in all industries. 455 of these fall-related fatalities occurred in non-construction industries. And that is why this emphasis program goes into all industries. Next slide, please. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Stay right on the scope there. Thank you. The NEP, and I'm just going to go down this slide real quick in the next two slides because these list the non-construction activities that are covered under the national emphasis programs. Rooftop mechanical work and maintenance, utility line employees, arborist and tree trimming, holiday light installation, road sign maintenance, and also billboards. Next slide, where this list continues. The power washing of buildings, as long as it's not connected to a painting operation, which is construction, but the power washing in general would not be construction. Gutter cleaning, chimney cleaning, window cleaning in some of the comm tower activities. Next slide. OSHA has been very consistent with what our goal is for this NEP. We want to stop unprotected exposures to fall hazards. In this national emphasis program sends another message to all industries that OSHA is serious about preventing falls, and we are collectively using all the tools in our toolbox. Enforcement, compliance assistance, outreach. We really need to turn this trend around. Next slide. And as I opened up with, this is the 11th annual safety stand down. And the goal has always been the same. Raise awareness for fall hazards, share how to prevent fatalities and injuries related to falls, and ultimately eliminate falls in construction, but also in other industries as well, because they are preventable. So the stand downs that do occur around the world, these afford employers and employees the opportunity to just take a moment, focus on the fall hazards they face and ways to protect themselves. You want to highlight and address other safety hazards that you could face on a daily basis, and also discuss the company safety policies and what the goals are for your individual company. Next slide, please. We also want you to receive a certificate of participation for holding the stand down. This is how we know who participated, where they are, and how much, where they are and how they participated. And with this information, it helps us provide a better product in the future. Also, it's the department's way of thanking employers for taking the time out to pause and stand down for worker safety. The feedback that we get through these certificates and evaluations helps us with improvements in the stand downs in the future. And we encourage you to give us comments and feedback. Next slide. You can go right to the next slide as well, too. So this year, we're doing something different. We in order to increase our outreach effort and impact, we have a premier partner program, which was initiated to include alliances and stakeholders that have historically been active participants in the stand down to prevent falls. And some of these organizations have been involved right from 2014. In partnership with NIOSH, CPWR, and OSHA, the premier partners are encouraged to increase participation of construction employers and employees. This is going to be done by providing and amplifying fall prevention resources, supporting safety stand down events, promoting webinars such as this one, directing and encouraging members in their networks to get a certificate so we can accurately include everybody that's been involved. Also, engage in social media activity and develop social media activity, such as videos that focus and demonstrate commitment to fall prevention. Next slide, please. And I want to wrap it up with the last two slides leading into Rich's presentation with competent person in fall prevention. The term competent person is used in many OSHA standards and documents. There are dozens of mentions in the construction standard alone, and it's important enough that OSHA dedicated a full web page with supporting links to topics. And you can see that web page up on the screen. Some of the examples of fall related to fall hazards include in subpart C, which is the general safety and health provisions. Programs shall provide frequent and regular inspections of job sites, materials, and equipment. These inspections need to be made by a competent person designated by the employer. Also, subpart L, scaffolding, which is related to fall hazard, mentions it at least a dozen times. And specifically in subpart M for fall prevention, it's mentioned a handful of times, specifically for personal fall arrest systems and components subject to impact loading shall be immediately removed from service and shall not be used again for employee protection until inspected and determined by a competent person to be undamaged and suitable for reuse. It also mentions it in the safety monitor section and the fall protection plan section. Next slide and last slide. But what is the competent person? It's one who is capable of identifying existing and predictable hazards in the surroundings or working conditions which are unsanitary, hazardous, or dangerous to employees, and who has the authorization to take prompt corrective measures to eliminate them. One, if not the most important takeaway related to competent person, the employer designates the competent person and gives the authority to promptly take corrective action to eliminate the identified hazards. That could be stopping work, removing employees from the hazards. So if you have one thing to remember, please remember that it is the employer that designates the competent person and gives them the authority to take the corrective action. So at this point, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Rich for the remainder of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you, Scott, as well. I really appreciate the information that was shared earlier. Fantastic program, and really appreciate being invited to this. So what we're going to be covering now is we are going to be covering rescue planning and the basics behind it. So what I want to do here is I'm going to share some information on different training techniques and things that you can do within your own company, give you this information so that you can go back and actually train your own employees specifically for fall rescue. Next slide. So first off, what we have to do is we have to come up with a plan, right? We have to understand what a fall rescue plan actually is. And the basics behind it are the rescue should be addressed in your company's written safety program. And it's unfortunate that we see that it isn't in many cases. As Scott shared some of the alarming information that many companies don't have rescue programs or have a plan in place to actually perform rescue if a fall were to occur. Beyond that, we have to talk about the fact that OSHA's 1926 subpart M requires prompt post-fall rescue. As a matter of fact, that's really a lot of what they say is they want to see that there is some type of prompt rescue in place. And for those of you that have asked questions about how quickly is quick enough, there isn't necessarily a time frame on how quickly someone should be rescued. OSHA specifically states it has to be prompt. There are some areas, in fact, that do have limitations on time, but for typical fall arrest situations, without energized equipment being around, the OSHA standards specifically state that it has to be a prompt rescue. So what we have to do is we have to understand what type of training is going to be necessary to train workers in the available rescue techniques and equipments that are specific to rescue operations. Next slide. So of course, with anything, with any fall, with any accident that occurs on a job site, we have to understand the first step is to call 911. But here's the thing about fall rescue. Many rescue workers are not trained in high angle rescue. As a matter of fact, high angle rescue involves rescuing people from places that can't be reached by typical aerial ladders. And so if you're working in an area where you may not have skyscrapers or areas where you have multiple fire departments that potentially have high angle rescue, you may have to understand that you're going to have to do this yourself. So what you're going to have to really do is implement your own rescue plan. Next slide. So what we have to understand about rescue is that there's two basic elements of rescue. The first is we want to delay orthostatic shock. And I'm going to get into exactly what orthostatic shock is in the next couple of slides. And then secondly, we want to bring that fallen worker to a supporting surface. Because here's the point. Many rescuers, as we just talked about, aren't necessarily comfortable being on a rooftop or up on a roof at high altitudes. As a matter of fact, most paramedic units or most rescue units want to be working on the patient at a ground level. So as much as we can do to get them to a surface, we're going to have to try to do that. And that's going to be a part of our rescue plan. Next slide. So we talked about orthostatic shock. We talked about harness-induced injuries or death. In many cases, it's called suspension trauma. But the basics behind it is that many researchers don't even understand why some people can hang for a long period of time while others cannot. As a matter of fact, researchers have said that death can occur after only a short time of being suspended in a harness. So let's kind of dive into that a little bit more. Next slide. So what is suspension trauma? Well, it can occur when your legs don't move and the legs are lower than the heart. And it's going to be complicated because the straps of a fall protection or fall arrest harness are going to be pinching off one of the largest arteries in your body, the femoral artery. And it can be complicated, of course, from other injuries like, broken bones, trauma, scrapes, cuts, bruises. Because let's remember, when you fall off a rooftop or you fall from a height, you're potentially going to fall and have other issues, maybe sliding into the side of a building, maybe hitting something on the way down, falling through rooftops or falling through areas of concern can cause other injuries. So we have to be, cognizant of those things as well. But if we look at what suspension trauma truly is, your fall has been arrested by harness. Your blood flow is now being impeded by the straps and gravity. Our legs are being pinched off from the leg harness around our femoral artery. The blood then starts to collect in the large leg muscles, and that blood return starts to decrease going back to the heart, and that becomes a problem. But here's the thing, our body's a wonderful mechanism, and because of that decrease, our body senses it, and it starts to increase the heart rate. And when that happens, there becomes a hormone release from pain. Of course, we're going to have adrenaline pumping, and that in turn creates more of a heart race, and our heart starts beating more. But again, our body then senses that there's blood being pooled somewhere. It's not coming through the normal system, and it decreases that and actually starts to decrease our blood pressure. When that happens, we start to get into some really dangerous areas, and blood flow to the brain begins to decrease. Of course, at that point, the victim can become unconscious. Blood flow begins to decrease even more. And if left alone, brain damage can occur. And if too long, can actually occur in death. Next slide. Oops. All right. So how can we as a rescuer understand some of the signs of suspension trauma? It's not necessarily that easy because, number one, our victim or a person that has fallen may be unconscious and may not be able to tell us exactly what's happened. But here's some of the signs that we can see without even being able to look at it. Fainting, shortness of breath, the patient or the fall victim has nausea or they become dizzy, they start to sweat, they start to have hot flashes, they begin to become pale, and then they get that tunnel vision or narrowing of vision. So these are things that if we can discuss or talk with them, we can kind of find out. And of course, their heart rate's going to be going. Many of these things are going to play into fact with just the fact that they've fallen over the rooftop and their adrenaline may be pumping and causing some of these issues. But some of those that are more delicate, that narrowing of the field of vision or loss of vision, some of the paleness or profuse sweating, those are things that we as a rescuer can start to determine or start to look at and potentially start that rescue technique or to get that person back to that rooftop or lowered to the ground. Next slide. So what rescue equipment is available to us? Well, there may be already equipment on site, ladders, scaffolds, personal lifts, pulleys, winches, or other descending devices can all be used, and they might just be right on site. We might have somebody that fell over the edge of a rooftop. If we can move a ladder into place to get that person back up to the roof or lowered back down to the ground, fantastic. We can use that type of thing. We can also use aerial lifts. We can also use other devices such as the pulley winch pictured here that can actually lower a person to the ground while connecting it to the anchor point on the rooftop. So there's going to be a lot of devices out there that we can use. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I talk about during many of my training sessions is that the safety industry itself is $1 billion a year industry, and they're coming up with new and innovative ideas all the time. And specifically, many of those things are being created for fall rescue. Next slide. So yeah, there's other rescue equipment out there, as we talked about. We have descending devices. We have drop-down ladder systems. We have rescue poles where we can actually go from the rooftop to rescue workers down below. We have winches that can actually be attached to that rescue pole and lowered down to a victim where they can then be cranked back up to the roof. And of course, someone asked this question prior to the program. DBI Sala and many other manufacturers have some backpacks that are descending devices built right into them. So in the case of a fall, you can actually, or a fall victim can actually take this and descend down to the ground. Now, of course, one thing that I always want to mention with this is that make sure that backpack is made specifically for the height of the area you're working in. We don't want to lower ourselves down to an area where we can't be rescued. So we want to make sure of that as well. Next slide. So again, the two critical parts of fall rescue, the two basic elements of any rescue plan and putting a program together are, number one, we want to delay orthostatic shock. Okay. And then secondly, we want to bring that fallen worker to a supporting surface. So what I've prepared for you in the next couple slides is some different techniques specific to how to rescue yourself, delay orthostatic shock, and potentially how to last while hanging over the edge of a rooftop. Next slide. So there's a lot of self-rescue strategies out there. Of course, cell phones or two-way radios, you know, a lot of us have these smartphones now. The problem with it is that we have to be conscious to be able to use it. We have to be physically able to use a cell phone. And from what we've done in our training on fall rescues, we found that cell phones either break, fall out, or they can't even be utilized due to where they are. Some people leave them on the rooftop. Some people have them in their pockets where the fall straps or the harness straps cover them up. And potentially, you know, we're looking at some type of a force on the body. That force could have been put on that phone as well through the event of a fall. So we really want to eliminate, you know, that as one of the techniques, although it's highly useful if that phone is still in an area where it can be utilized to call someone for help. But we want to mainly get to these other ones because these are the typical ways to delay that orthostatic shock and allow ourselves to rescue ourselves. So today we're going to talk about the boatswain's technique. We're going to talk about the Prusik loop technique, suspension trauma straps and slings. And then we're going to talk about the lifeline loop and the foot wrap as ways to self-rescue ourselves. And in reality, it's more of a how can we prevent that orthostatic shock or delay orthostatic shock from occurring so that rescuers can then get to us. Next slide. So we talked about the cell phones, and this is a must. Single workers, people that are out there alone on a job site, need a way to call for help. The problem again is that they need to be able to actually use that phone or use that smartphone or that two-way radio to get help. And so this is one of those areas where we talk about this as a means for rescue, but we also have to understand that there's a lot of limitations when it comes to this type. The next slides that we get to, we're going to talk specifically on the techniques to delay orthostatic shock and to really help yourself. Let's go to the next slide. And the first one we're going to talk about is the boatswain's chair. And you can see this one. This was used for years in the Navy. We've talked about this where people have gone over the side of boats to paint the side or scrape off barnacles, go up on the mast to actually go. And it's somewhat of a chair that's hooked up to a rope top and an anchor point above you. So what we're going to teach you now is a specific technique. And what I want you to get out of this part of the program is that these are things that you can go back to your shop. These are things that you can actually work with and train your own employees specifically on how to perform self-rescue techniques. And I'm going to show you a number of them. So what I want you to do is go back and choose the one that works best for you, which one works best for your company, and maybe take a variety of them, of many of these, just in case you come into a situation where you may not have one of the other techniques or not be able to perform one of those. So the first one is called the boatswain's chair. And we're going to take a look at it if you'll show the video on the next one.
So now, as you can see, I've been raised to a height to simulate a fall over the edge of the roof. The first technique I'm going to teach you is that of the use of a bosun's chair. So I'm going to actually use the harness to actually make a seat to sit in, removing a lot of the pressure from my groin area. So in order to do this, what we want to do is actually get to the straps around our butt and actually try and move them up. Somewhat like this. And it completely will relieve that stress from the groin area and that pressure in that groin area. And in this situation, I feel like I could comfortably sit here for a lot longer than I could have had I been in the other situation. And recall what I said earlier was that this can be used with an SRL or with a lifeline system.
So the really nice thing about that is this can be done with an SRL if you're using an SRL or a retracting lifeline, or even if you're using a lifeline that's going to hang down next to you. Some of the techniques today are going to be specifically for SRL, and some of them are going to be specifically if you have a lifeline down next to you. So you've fallen, your rope grab catches on the lifeline, and that lifeline there should be some length of it next to you. And we're going to teach you some techniques there. But again, one of the biggest things about this is we're using our own harness, and many of them have them built in already. But many of them don't. And so what you can do is you can actually take your thumbs and move down on the leg straps of the harness and create almost a seat of sorts And what that does is it takes the pressure off that femoral artery in that groin area, and basically allows you to hang for a much longer period of time, because now our femoral artery isn't being pinched off and that blood flow is now occurring naturally. Let's go to the next one. The next technique is a Prusik loop. And the really nice thing about this, a lot of the old timers, when I first got into the industry, talked about always having an extra strand or a loop of rope that they would keep on their harnesses in the event of a fall. And what they did is they used this as a means to actually go ahead and perform a self-rescue or a delay of that orthostatic shock again. And the really cool part about this, as I'll mention in the video, is that in the event of a fall, if we can get to our boot or our shoe, we can also pull our shoelace off or our bootlace off and create a loop just like this, and in fact use it as a Prusik loop for rescue. So let's take a look at this next video.
In this next technique, I'm going to teach you another method to use to self-rescue. It's called the Prusik loop. I have one here hanging on my chest, and basically you could keep a rope or a system or a loop of sorts on your side, in your pocket, on your harness, tied somewhere, or in other scenarios you could even untie your boot or your shoe and grab a lace. Prusik loop is quite simple in that all we do is we take the rope and wrap it around multiple times to create a loop of sorts that, when tightened, will actually tighten around the rope. In this situation, I basically take the loop, I've wrapped it around the rope, and now once again I have another foothold where I can relieve the pressure off my groin area.
Okay, so again, we're delaying orthostatic shock. We're actually relieving that pressure from that femoral artery, and we're able to stand and wait for rescue to occur. The other part of this is if we have two Prusik loops, what we can start to do is actually build those up the rope and actually create somewhat of a ladder to get back up to that rooftop. So it is a technique that I find to be one of the easiest techniques. As long as you understand the rope, the wrapping technique around that lifeline, this is a great one and seems to be really easy to utilize. Let's take a look at the next slide. Okay, this next one is something that I think many of us know. Many harnesses today are now coming with suspension trauma straps, but they can also be purchased by manufacturers after the fact and added to almost any harness. And the nice thing about these is they're simple to utilize and they're easy. Again, as long as we're conscious, we're able to do this. This technique is really simple. The one I'm going to be showing in this demonstration is I purchased after the fact from a manufacturer. And what it does, I have two zip pouches on my sides. I drop them down and I'm able to stand and again, relieve pressure. Now, one of the things I want to note about this type is that it's important that you try these out ahead of time and understand that you get the right height specifically for you when utilizing these, because it's important when you're hanging to try and get a little hook through a little loop on another rope. It's going to be daunting. And with your adrenaline pumping and everything going, it's going to be important that you set these up ahead of time. And again, practice these ahead of time as much as possible. So let's take a look at the video.
In this next technique, I'm going to show you a suspension trauma straps. These can be purchased aftermarket, or many harnesses nowadays come with them. The one that I'm using today, basically the manufacturer makes these in zip little pouches that hang down from the side of your harness. And I'll drop these down one at a time. Drop down the right side and drop down the left side. And what I've done on this scenario is I've taken a hook and I'll reconnect it with the other side in a little loop, and I'll drop this down by my feet. In this scenario, I basically stand in this and stand up, relieving all the pressure off my groin area once again. And with this, it can be single strap or double strap as we have it. But the basics behind it is that we're trying to relieve that pressure from the groin area. In this scenario, once again, I could stand for a long time before being rescued. And let's face it, that's the real reason we're teaching these techniques today.
So with that one, definitely, it's an easy technique. As I've stated, many harnesses now come with those built right in. And the concept behind it is a little bit different in how it relieves that pressure. What it's going to do is actually going to hook up to your hip straps on your harness. And when you stand, it actually pulls the hip straps down. which then lightens the pressure on the leg straps. All in all, again, we're allowing that blood to flow more easily and allowing that femoral artery to open back up instead of being constricted, as is the case once we have that fall and all of our weight is hanging there. Let's take a look at the next slide. So this next one is a multi-step one. And again, this comes when we have a lifeline next to us. We've fallen, a rope grab has enacted, and now we're hanging, and we should have some type of rope beside us. In this case, what we're going to do is simply take and make a loop and then stand that loop, just like we have with many of the other techniques. We're trying to relieve that pressure from that femoral artery. So let's take a look at this one. It's a multi-step process, but again, a really easy one. But remember, it takes practice on all of these. So remember, if you're going to do one of these techniques, practice those specific techniques, get comfortable when using them, because in the event of a fall, our adrenaline's going to be going, and we may be injured in some way, shape, or form. So by practicing these techniques, it's going to give us a little bit better shot at rescuing ourselves or delaying that orthostatic shock. So let's take a look at the next slide.
In this next scenario, we're going to be talking about another situation. I've fallen over the edge of the roof and I have a lifeline system on. What we're simulating here is that the rope grab is above me and that the excess lifeline line is down beside me. So in the first technique I'm going to be teaching, we're going to be talking about a lifeline loop. And it's quite simple. Basically, tie a loop, step in it, and relieve the pressure from your legs. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by getting the loop set and tying a knot into it. You want to make it big enough because, believe me, when you're hanging, trying to get a loop around your boot is not as easy as it might seem. So what I've done is I created a knot, I created a loop, and now I can put that around my boot. And with that, I can then stand up and relieve the pressure from my groin area. Quite simple, and to be honest, I think I could stand here for quite some time as compared to hanging.
All right, and let's show one more. We've got the next one, which is a number of different steps. So if you want to go through these rows of these next couple slides, we can go through the 5 steps, and then we can get to the next one, which is the foot wrap. It's one of our last techniques that we're going to talk about, and it's another one that really does work really well. So there's step 1. Go to the next slide. 2, 3, 4, and lastly 5.
In this next technique, I'm going to be talking about the foot wrap. And it's quite simple. Go to the inside of your foot, wrap a loop, come over the top, and actually step into it. And you can step up, relieving the pressure from the groin area once again.
And again, another simple technique, but it's important on this one that you practice, because we hold these in the classroom setting with these tripods, and we always get people going around the outside of the foot. Remember to go to the inside of the foot, get enough length where your knee is bent, and that you're actually going to be relieving some pressure once you step up into it. But again, all these techniques, they're self-rescue strategies so that you can be rescued, because what our main purpose, again, is to delay that orthostatic shock and then bring that fallen worker to a rescuing surface, either up on the rooftop or down below. Next slide. Okay, so again, we've got some self-rescue strategies. You know, imminent danger situations, we want to just get somebody, whatever we can do to rescue that person is going to be important. Self-rescue lanyards, backpack systems, rescue pole systems. We've got all those other techniques that we just went through that are all available to you. And with this webinar, all those videos are going to be included as well. And everything you saw is going to be available as well. So the important part of it is setting the system up, getting that training out there, and make sure that your employees are practicing these techniques as much as possible, so that in the event of a fall, they can self-rescue themselves or they can delay that orthostatic shock. Let's take a look at the last 2 slides here. And I know this was a specific question that was brought up. After a fall, what are the first aid techniques that we want to do? Number 1, we want to carefully handle that rescued worker, because we don't know, again, what other things may have occurred during that fall, broken bones, other impacts, bruises, or other issues that may have occurred. And the important part of this is that once we get them to a rescuing surface, that we make sure they're put into a sitting position, knees up to their chest as much as possible, to delay that quick release of blood. We don't want to lay them on their back as much as possible, because if we do that, that quick release of coagulated blood, or deoxygenated blood as it is, could potentially cause them to go into cardiac arrest. So great question from somebody out there. Basically, position of comfort on the ground is ready, something made for transport. And then lastly, if you have the availability to administer oxygen, definitely get that going as well. All right, next slide. And this is the last one I'm going to do before I hand it off to Chris. But if we were to have any type of a fall, make sure once that fall has occurred, according to 1926 502 D19, we need to immediately take that equipment out of service if it's been subjected to an impact loading. And two examples are in an SRL, self-retracting lifeline, you're going to see the upper situation. Typically, they have some type of indicator that when there's an impact fall, that indicator will pop out and you'll get a different color, or some type of systems will show different flagging or something along those lines. And lastly, on the harness itself, many of them nowadays have some type of fall indicator. It could be on the back of the harness. It could be on the front of the harness. This one actually has a rip stitch, so that when you are subjected to an impact fall, that rip stitch will open up, and you'll see that piece of equipment needs to be taken out of service immediately. Of course, with SRLs, we don't want to just throw those out. In many cases, manufacturers can refurbish them and recycle those back in the program after they've been inspected. As far as the harnesses go, in many cases, if they've been subjected to an impact fall, they need to be taken out of service and disposed of. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris Kane. Chris.
Thanks, Rich. I'm going to just flash on a couple of the resources that we've updated, refreshed, and a couple of new ones. Almost all of these are available on stopconstructionfalls.com. So if you can advance to the next slide, the first resource, of course, on our website is plenty of information about rules and regulations, where a lot of the questions that have been asked here can be answered. The next slide goes into fall protection plan. If you don't know where to start, this is a great start. Right on stopconstructionfalls.com, we've got a plan for you. Fill out the blanks. Fill in the blanks. It's available in English and Spanish. The next slide talks about a daily checklist. Really focusing on the small contractors, which are the focus of this campaign. As Scott talked about in the beginning, we see an incredible disparate risk for workers who work for small contractors. So these are the tools that we developed for them and to share with them. The daily checklist, and then moving on to a detailed fall prevention plan and rescue plan. Where to get started on a rescue plan, right here. We've got it in English and Spanish for you. The next resource that I wanted to highlight is really important, because so much of the time when we talk about preventing falls, we focus on personal fall arrest systems. And we really need to always be thinking about the hierarchy of controls, and safety and health across the board is to eliminate the risk. Eliminating fall hazards by putting in place guardrails is a much more effective method than the complex method of personal fall arrest systems. Because you don't have to deal with rescue when you prevent the fall. So thinking about the hierarchy of controls is something that's we advocate for, and we have this resource available again in English and Spanish. The next resource is a detailed resource and tip sheet on rescue planning. And then the next resource is brand new. We have just put it out on Leading Edge. This is an incredibly difficult and complicated topic. We've had detailed webinars in the past on this with the nation's leading experts on leading edge protection. And it's a complicated, there's many factors that go into place when you talk about using personal fall arrest systems around leading edge work. But we've put together a tip sheet with those experts and have it available for you. Spanish is coming imminently, but we've just posted this one on CPWR.com, and Jess is putting the links in here. And of course, the next resource I wanted to highlight is another brand new resource that Jess and her team have been working on with a panel of experts on head protection. If you are wearing a hard hat and you have a fall and the hard hat falls off and you hit your head, the prognosis is going to be very, very bad. When there's a great movement in our industry to move towards head protection that stays on the head during a fall, doesn't tip off easily in the form of helmets. But we really get into the nuts and bolts of helping employers choose head protection, understanding that not all helmets are created equal, and what are the ins and outs of this guidance of head protection. So hats off to our R2P team for working with a panel of experts to bring you this brand new resource. The next slide, just reminding you with the new partners that we've brought into the campaign this year, a number of them have developed videos to share the message aimed at all different parts of our industry. And these are all available on stopconstructionfalls.com on our premier partner page. And the last slide that I wanted to mention is thinking about Safe and Sound Week. It's an OSHA-led campaign that we participate in as a campaign organizer. And it's really just about adopting planning, adopting programs across the board to improve worker safety and health. And we will be gearing up for Safe and Sound Week this summer again. The last slide is a thank you slide. I have a number of questions, but I promised to get our speakers off at 2:58, and it's 2:58 because we have 3 p.m. appointments. So most of the questions that were asked in advance of the webinar have been answered in the course of the webinar. So there were a few that came in on the Q&A that I did want to flag for us to get back to individual questioners, Jessica and Rosa, if we're able to. And with that, I'm going to wrap up and say thank you, gentlemen, for presenting with us and being part of this webinar. And we really appreciate your work all year round to try to reduce the number of workers who are killed and hurt by falls in our industry. Thanks so much, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the rest of the team that helped put this together.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you very much.